Morning, church. My name is Cheryl, and today's scripture reading comes from 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 12 to chapter 4, verse 12. Abner, the son of Ner, and the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon, and the battle was very fierce that day. And Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. There was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, and David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. And the sons were born to David at Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon of Ahinoam of Jezreel, and his second, Chileab of Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel, and the third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur, and the fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith, and the fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital, and the sixth, Ithream of Eglah, David's wife. While there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul. Now Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah. And Ishbosheth said to Abner, "Why have you gone into my father's concubine?" Then Abner was very angry. "I keep showing steadfast love to the house of Saul, and have not given you into the hand of David. God do so to Abner, and more also, if I do not accomplish for David what the Lord has sworn to him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul, and set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah, from Dan to Beersheba." Abner sent messengers to David. "Make your covenant with me, and behold, my hand shall be with you to bring over all Israel to you." And he said, "Good, I will make a covenant with you, but one thing I require of you. Bring Michal, Saul's daughter." And Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband, Paltiel. Her husband went with her, weeping after her. And Abner conferred with the elders of Israel. "For some time past, you have been seeking David as king over you. Now then, bring it about, for the Lord has promised David, saying, 'By the hand of my servant David, I will save my people Israel from the hand of all their enemies.'" Abner went to tell David at Hebron that all Israel thought good to do. David made a feast for Abner. Abner said to David, "I will gather all Israel, that you may reign over all that your heart desires." So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. Just then, Joab returned. It was told Joab, Abner came to the king. Joab sent messengers after Abner. Abner returned to Hebron. Joab took him aside, and there he struck him in the stomach, so he died for the blood of Asahel his brother. David said, "I and my kingdom are forever guiltless before the Lord for the blood of Abner. May it fall upon the head of Joab." So Joab killed Abner because he had put their brother Asahel to death in the battle at Gibeon. And the king said, "I was gentle today, though anointed king. These men, sons of Zeruiah, are more severe than I." When Ishbosheth, Saul's son, heard that Abner had died at Hebron, his courage failed, and all Israel was dismayed. Now captains, Baanah and Reshab, set out, and about the heat of the day, they came to the house of Ishbosheth as he was taking his noonday rest, and came into the midst of the house, and they stabbed him in the stomach and beheaded him. They took his head and brought the head to David at Hebron. But David answered, "Wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house on his bed." David commanded his young men, and they killed them and cut off their heads and feet and hanged them beside the pool at Hebron. When you enter the land and you say, "Let us set a king over us like all the nations around us," he must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. These are the true words of the living God.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. Well read. Well, good to see you all. Going to dive straight in this morning. So, do you know what a hot mess is? A hot mess is, this is just for the purposes of today, my definition. A hot mess is when every actor in the drama is making extremely poor choices, which is hurting everyone else. That's a hot mess. Have you ever been in a hot mess? You know, when sometimes you're in the situation and you just look around and you just see there's just carnage everywhere. There's actor A, B, C, D, and E, and you all just seem to be, and maybe you're included in this hot mess, just making mistake after mistake, and there's just tragedy and difficulty, and people are getting hurt, and this thing just seems like such a big, complicated mess. You just don't know how to get out of it. Well, welcome to the hot mess of 2 Samuel chapter 2, 3, and 4. Because that is exactly what is going on. And somehow, God has a way through the hot mess. Isn't that wonderful? God always has a plan. God always has hope. And God always has a solution for every hot mess. Because He is working. He is working always in every situation. So that is the challenge of the passage before us today. To give you a recap, maybe you were away in Hong Kong on the last weekend, I'm not sure. But last week we saw in chapter 2 how David was crowned king over Judah, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And Abner got cozy with Ishbosheth, made him his puppet king in the house of Saul, and started challenging entered into effectively civil war, which is detailed here as well. So that's some of the backdrop for our narrative today. I want to give you the quick synopsis of where we're going in this sermon, and I'm going to make 4 points. The first is to look at the mess of ambition. Number 1, the mess of ambition, and here we're going to focus on Mr. Abner. Point number 2 is the mess of bitterness and jealousy, and here our star performer is Joab. The mess of ambition, Abner. The mess of bitterness and jealousy, Joab. And what about the mess of insecurity? Number 3 is our hero, King David. The mess of insecurity. And then finally, just so that we can all go home with a little bit of hope in our hearts, point number 4, which is where we're landing, is that in the mess, God works His kingdom purpose. So that's your takeaway today. In the mess, God works His kingdom purpose. So here's the big idea, as I like to put it for today. Even though there is so much mess, so if you're going to remember one thing today, it's this. Even though there is so much mess, we can trust that God is working His kingdom purposes. When we look at this story, the big point that is coming across is that even though there's so much mess, we can trust that God is working His kingdom purposes. Okay, well, let's look at our first actor in the drama is Abner. And this is the mess of ambition. Now, we met Abner last week. He is under the house of Saul. Saul is dead, so he's the chief of the army. He wants to retain his position. He wants the house of Saul to come out on top, even though he knows that God's purpose is for David and the house of Judah to rule the kingdom, all of the 12 tribes. Abner doesn't like this, and so he arranges for Ishbosheth, son of Saul, to become the king so that he can control him behind the scenes. This is Abner. Abner is a man of ungodly ambition. He knows full well what God's plan is for this kingdom. And the plan is not the house of Saul. The plan is not Ishbosheth. The plan is not Abner. It's David. But he's a man of ambition. And so we read in verse 6 of chapter 3, while there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David. You see, there's civil war going on in this nation. It's a hot mess. Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul. He is working his way up the corporate ladder in the house of Saul to try and get as close to the power system as possible. Not only is he ambitious within the house of Saul, but his ambition flows out into the rest of the nation. Because in verse 1, we read, go back to chapter 2 rather, we read here, and this is recorded for us, is that Abner is he's agitating civil war in the country. That's quite a price to pay for your ambition. You want the CEO job, and you will stop at nothing, even if it means a country is at war internally with itself. And so in chapter 2, verse 12, Abner, the son of Ner, and the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. That's a polite way of saying they marched a very long way to get within 5 kilometers of Jerusalem to declare war on David and to wipe him out and to seize control back in this kingdom. Verse 17, and the battle was very fierce that day. So Abner's ambition leads him to actually plunge the nation into civil war. That's a strong passion in this man for his own feathered nest. But unfortunately, he bet on the wrong horse. I don't know if you've ever betted on the horses. I never have. But in this case, metaphorically, he bet on the wrong horse, because what we read here in verse 1 is that in this civil war, and this probably took place over about 7 years, the house of Saul started losing. So he bet on the losing horse. Verse 1, there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, and David grew stronger and stronger while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. So put yourself in Abner's filthy shoes. You've got this plan to kind of get as close to the crown as possible and to be the top dog, but you start seeing the thing going the wrong way. You've made a losing bet. You're a man of ambition. It's all about you. It's all about number one. It's all about Mr. Narcissist. He wants it. And so what do? Well, what you do is you then look for who else. Where's the power really going? Well, let me just, because people who are bent on ambition just are thinking of themselves, and their principles and morals go out the window. So he just makes a beeline for David. David's the man of the future. Better get close to him. And so we see this in verse 7. I'll have to explain it. Now Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah. Okay, remember, Saul is the dead king. And Ishbosheth, who is the son of Saul, who's now the new king, said to Abner, why have you gone into my father's concubine? And then Abner was very angry. And then he says to Ishbosheth, I keep showing steadfast love to the house of Saul and have not given you into the hand of David. Okay, so let me decode that for you. When the dead king dies, the dead king's woman becomes a prize. She becomes the target of succession. So the accusation here is from Ishbosheth saying, hey, Abner, you're making a move on the dead king's woman. You have in mind that you are going to be the new king and succession is going to come from you, kind of thing. In other words, he's accusing him of you're making a power play to take my job as the king. That's what Ishbosheth is really saying. Now, we don't know if this is true. Did Abner do that? Did he not do that? We're not sure. Either way, it's irrelevant, because he answers the charge that you are not loyal to me by being disloyal to Ishbosheth and proceeding to go straight to David. So either way, he's a snake in the grass, this guy. He is, it's not working out. I've been challenged by Ishbosheth. I'm going to switch sides. And he kind of uses this insult. He says it's an insult. It's not true. We never quite know what the real story is with Rizpah, the concubine. But either way, there's a fallout, and he makes his way to David. This is in verse 12. Abner sent messengers to David. Make your covenant with me, and behold, my hand shall be with you to bring over all Israel to you. So he switches sides. He brokers the deal. Look in verse 17. And Abner conferred with the elders of Israel. For some time past, you have been seeking David as king over you. So he gathers up all the people who are meant to be loyal to Ishbosheth. And he says, hey, in the past, you guys knew that David was going to be king. You've discussed this. Verse 19. Abner went to tell David at Hebron all that Israel had thought good to do. So he gets a caucus. They all agree. David is the new guy. Ishbosheth is the man of the past. And then Abner worms his way to David. Verse 21. Abner said to David, I will gather all Israel, that you may reign over all that your heart desires. So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. So we have a picture here of a mess. We have a man who is ambitious. We have a man who can't be trusted. He's power hungry. He's selfish. He makes all the right noises. He says, we'll get to this in a moment. David, you're going to be king. This is God's plan. For 7 years, that hasn't been a factor in Abner's thinking. He couldn't care less about God's plan and the kingdom and coming through David for 7 years, even to the point of risking other people's lives. splitting the kingdom, because it was all about him. And now that Ishbosheth is old news, he cozies up to David. In a word, Abner wants power, not God's kingdom. So, here are my questions for you. Number one, have you been hurt by someone else's selfish ambition? Abner's hurt many people in this process. What about you? You might be sitting here with real injury because someone has backstabbed you at work. I'm not sure. Maybe the leader of your system, whatever that is all about him or herself and has impacted you in some way. But let me flip it on you, because my second question is this. What about you? Do you love the kingdom more than your own selfish ambition? Do you love the kingdom more than you love your own selfish ambition? I'm going to ask you 6 questions today, by the way. That's the first 2. Okay, so that's the hot mess that Abner has created. What about the second hot mess, which is the mess of bitterness and jealousy? All right, so selfish ambition, that can really hurt. But what about people who are bitter and jealous? That can also hurt. And here we are going to focus in on Joab. Joab is the head of the army on David's side. Abner is head of the army on Ishbosheth's side. Joab is head of the army on David's side. And here's the backstory. You read just now about the battle, the civil war. There was a battle at Gibeon, big fight, big fierce battle, it says. And unfortunately, in this battle, Joab's brother got killed by Abner. Joab's brother got killed, Ashael is his name, got killed by Joab in the war. You know, nothing personal. It was just people die in a war. And it just happened to be Abner killed Joab's brother. Can you imagine being number 2 to David, head of the army? You're away on a fishing trip. You come back and you discover that the head of the army on the enemy side, who happens to be the guy who killed your brother, is now holding secret talks with David, and you don't know about it. And you know Abner is a snake in the grass, and he's all about himself, and he's selfish. And of all people, the guy who killed your brother is now talking to your boss about bringing the 2 kingdoms together. And possibly this guy might get your job. That would, in the interests of politics and optics and bringing these 2 sides together, you could be out of a job, and it goes to the guy who killed your brother. So here we have this poison cocktail of bitterness, the guy who killed your brother, and jealousy, the guy who might take my job. Look, we don't know this for sure. We're just reading between the lines here, trying to make sense of the story that is being given to us. And so in verse 22, we read, Joab discovers this scheme of Abner's. Just then, Joab returned. Verse 23, it was told Joab, Abner came to the king. Well, you don't rise to the head of the military by not having some strategy and some strength and some, if you need to do something, you got to do it. You got to do what you got to do, right? That's how you get to be the head of the army, I imagine. Well, the backstabber got stabbed. Abner, the backstabber, got stabbed, because as soon as Joab comes back and he hears about this, he's like, no. So he, and this is, you can pick it up with me in verse 26, he calls, sends some messengers. Verse 26, Joab sent messengers after Abner. Abner's now on his way back. He's broken the peace treaty between these 2 warring factions. He's ended the civil war. Well done, Abner. And he's on his way back. Joab comes back, hears about this, sends some messages. Hey guys, hurry, get to him quickly before he's too far. Verse 27, Abner returned to Hebron on the strength of these assurances and the message that went out from Joab. Joab took him aside, and you can read the detail for yourself. It was like basically a dark alley. Joab took him aside, and there he struck him in the stomach so that he died for the blood of Asahel, his brother. Verse 30. So Joab killed Abner because he had put his brother Asahel to death in the battle of Gibeon. Now, what's wrong with this? Okay, number one, it's murder. Number two, he's bitter. It's not going to do anything for his bitterness. Now he's got bitterness and guilt. And, okay, he may have solved the jealousy problem by getting rid of the rival. But it's all about him. Because, just picture it like this. The country, just imagine you live in a country that's been at war with itself for 7 long years. And finally, the leaders are getting to talk, and they're going to put an end to the violence and the needless bloodshed. And you are so happy about this. For you to go and kill the primary guy on the other side who's brokering the peace deal is going to throw the whole thing into jeopardy. And you're David's number 2, and you knife the representative from the other side. That is going to throw the cat amongst the pigeons when it comes to the peace talks, the negotiating table. He's not thinking about anyone else but himself, is what I'm trying to say. So let me put it like this. Joab's personal agenda recklessly jeopardized God's kingdom agenda, because God wants a united kingdom. He wants one nation to be ruled by his appointed king, David. That's God's big plan. That's his purpose. And here it seems like everyone is getting in the way of it. God is somehow using Abner to come across. Okay, we don't quite trust his motives, but it's happening. And just when that's looking promising for everybody, and David is now going to cement his reign over everything, it gets thrown into jeopardy by Joab, acting out of bitterness and jealousy. So, you might be in a hot mess with bitter and jealous people. I'm not sure. So my question to you is, how has bitterness and jealousy hurt you? See, these are real things that we experience in our lives. You might not have had your brother killed by someone, but you may have suffered other loss. But right back at you. Next question. Is your bitterness and jealousy, maybe you've been impacted by it, but maybe you're also contributing. Maybe you're also the cause of this stuff to someone else. Is your bitterness and jealousy in the way of God's kingdom coming? Because if we do have bitterness and jealousy in our hearts, that is not the stuff of the kingdom of light. And that is going to impact and hurt others. So there's a big call in this text for us today to make sure we deal with these things in our own hearts. All right, the third mess, it's just getting better and better this morning, is the mess of insecurity. The mess of insecurity. And here we are focusing in on David. And what I love about the Bible is just so brutally honest. David is this king, and he's this mighty guy, and Jesus is the son of David, and David is on a pedestal, and he's this incredible, he can do anything. He can sing, he's terribly good looking, he's great with sheep, he's brilliant with giants, he's a military man, the guy is so unbelievably gifted. And yet he's got this heart after God, and goodness sake, he writes so many psalms in the Bible, and wow, what a guy. But it's also very honest about his failings. And this is a failing which you might see at first instances like, wow, why does the guy have so many wives? That is a failing, by the way. But there's a deeper level to this failing as well. So let's dig into that. Because remember, the kingdom is promised to David. He gets anointed by Samuel. Remember that way back in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel? David, you're going to be the king. God is going to bring you to the throne. You can outlast Saul, put up with all his nonsense, spear throwing him, pursuing you, trying to put you to death. Don't retaliate. Trust God. The kingdom is going to be yours because God has said so. I don't know if you can relate to that in some level. God has given you a promise, but at times your faith just feels weak and you sort of crumble and you disbelieve that God has got things. And here's a classic example of David's faith being weak. And he gives in to some pressure. God has promised him the kingdom. So what does he do? he marries as many prominent, significant women as possible. Because that's what you did in the old days. If you were a king, you made alliances by marrying other powerful people's daughters or women folk. And then now, okay, you and me, our families, we're together. Okay, and then you go and marry off again, another political strategic alliance. So that's how we understand this. This is what the writer in those times, in that context, is trying to tell you. It's also a show of strength. The more other women you marry who are prominent and influential and significant, the more strong your little kingdom is going to be. So it's trying to say David is really strong, but it's also being honest as to how he's going about getting the kingdom. He's taking matters into his own hands by shoring up his alliances, by marrying into powerful families. So that's how we understand chapter 3, verse 2 to 5. And sons were born to David in Hebron. So this is quite a lot of polygamy going on here. First one was Amnon from Ahinoam. Second was someone who came from Abigail. Remember Abigail, wife of Nabal. The third was Absalom. Bookmark that. We're going to meet Absalom in the chapters to come. And significantly, this was the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, the king of Jeshua. So that's a fact. Oh, he's making alliance with Jeshua now. The fourth, Adonijah, Haggith. The fifth came from Abital. And the sixth came from Eglah. 6 wives that we know of. He's taking matters into his own hands. And then, just because there's a complete brutal honesty going on in this passage, remember after Abner comes and they have this peace deal, one of the conditions of the peace deal, I don't know if you can remember this from when Cheryl read it to us, is this thing is only going to happen if you give me Michal, daughter of Saul. You remember that bit? That's in verse 13. And he said, this is David, good, I will make a covenant with you, Abner, but one thing I require of you, bring Michal, Saul's daughter, and Ishbosheth. So he somehow persuaded Ishbosheth to cough up Michal. And Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband. So she's married to this other guy, Paltiel. Then we have this most tragic verse in 16. She gets effectively abducted, ripped from her husband, taken to David. And here we read, her husband, Paltiel, went with her, weeping after her. David is a homewrecker. Why Michal? Well, in David's mind, daughter of Saul, she marries me and we produce a child. That then really brings everything together. But it's a shortcut. It's not trusting God. And in fact, he's breaking the law. So just that we're all absolutely clear about this. Okay, not only is, if we, get a microscope into his heart, not only is there suspicion that he's really not trusting the promise that God is going to do it, he's not making all these strategic alliances. But we just know flat out that it's against God's law. Because we read here in Deuteronomy chapter 17, God says, when you enter the land, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us, God says, don't let the king do A, B, C, and D. And D, at verse 17, is this. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. So just that we're all clear, David is wrong. He's wrong to do this on multiple levels. It's a hot mess. We have people acting out of selfish ambition. We have people acting out of bitterness and jealousy. And here we have people acting out of insecurity, not believing that God is all-powerful and that God is going to do what God said he was going to do. There are not too many people looking peachy in this story, are there? It's a hot mess. And so let's put it like this. Leaders fail. The Bible is so beautifully honest. Leaders fail. Your leaders are going to let you down. David is the leader of the nation. And he's failing on some level here. David didn't wholeheartedly trust God's promise. And so we are on a split level. Yes, leaders fail. Yes, that hurts us. But our hearts, when we come into contact with leaders who fail, our hearts cry out for a leader who won't fail. And that's where we're getting to in point 4. So my questions to you: how is the insecurity of others hurting your life? And poignantly to you, what promises do you need to trust God for? Where are you insecure because you're not dwelling in the trust of God and His good promises? And that is then causing carnage and difficulty to others. Those are my questions to you. Okay, welcome to the hot mess. 26 minutes of hot mess. But here's the beautiful thing in the story, is that despite all of these people doing their stuff, acting out of all this wrong motivation and making poor choices, God is at work. Yay, I heard someone say. Thank you, Teddy. Thanks, Tim, for producing that baby sound at the right moment there. God is at work. God is powerfully at work. You see, God's plans, fortunately, are not contingent upon humans, although He is using humans. In the mess, God works His kingdom purpose. That's point number 4. We do see some remarkable things. It's amazing that Abner, look, we know we can't necessarily trust him entirely, but isn't it amazing that he does at least come over to David to bring it together? Isn't it amazing that the elders of Israel say, let's end this war, let us unify, let's come under David? That must be a hand of God. That must be the work of God. And that's what the writer is suggesting to us, helping us see that despite all these difficulties, and then when Abner eventually gets there, then Joab's murder gets in the way. And David is holding it together. And to his credit, he does actually greet Abner with peace. He could have said, no, we're going to crush you. God said, well, the kingdom is mine, we're going to wipe you out. But he actually receives Abner. Look here in verse 20. David made a feast for Abner. Verse 21. David sent Abner away and he went in peace. He actually brought them together in peace. When Joab kills Abner, David throws Joab under the bus. He makes it very clear that it's not him who killed Abner. He's working towards peace. He's trying to hold it together. Again, this is evidence of God. It's amazing that at that point, the people of Israel went, we can't trust you. We come across with peace terms and you just knife us in a dark alley with Joab. No, David is working under God, to bring things together. He somehow perseveres the peace. Preserves at least. And ultimately, and this is some of the clue in the text that's given us, ultimately the kingdom is promised by God. And ultimately God's purpose will prevail. And so let's encourage ourselves in verse 9, chapter 3. Coming even from the most unlikely source, Abner himself, who's declared war on David for 7 long years. And in verse 9 he says, God do so to Abner and more also, talking to Ishbosheth, he says, if I do not accomplish for David what the Lord has sworn to him. You see, he acknowledges that God has sworn, made an oath to David, that the kingdom will be under David. That is the future of history, without that being a contradiction. That is where God's plan, His purpose, that is what history will show, says Abner, because God has sworn it. Verse 10, to transfer the kingdom. This is what God wants to accomplish from the house of Saul and set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah. There's a repeat in verse 18. Abner talking to the elders of Israel. Now then, bring it about, for the Lord has promised David, saying, by the hand of my servant David, I'll save my people Israel from the hand of all their enemies. God is at work in the middle of all of this. And then in chapter 4, don't have a lot of time to get into it, but the headline in chapter 4 is Ishbosheth dies. Okay, he dies brutally. But again, it's God has allowed this. Ishbosheth's out the way, Abner is out the way, the elders of Israel want to bring it together, and finally, at last, the way is clear for a straight shot for David to get onto the throne and for all the nation to come together. Somehow, despite all this poor character, despite the mess of insecurity, the mess of bitterness and jealousy, and the mess of pride and selfish ambition, the end result is the way is clear for God's purpose to come about, just as He promised. And so this brings us to Jesus. This story reveals King Jesus, who set aside his personal ambition, trusted in God, and without bitterness brought God's kingdom. You see, in the hot mess of earth, in the hot mess of sin down here on the ground, in the terror that sin causes, in my heart and in your heart, the damage and the pain and the brokenness and the non-idealness of the world, in this total hot mess of everyone just doing whatever they see fit, causing such devastation and destruction, in rebellion against God, God's purpose prevails. At the end of the day, at the end of history, we look and we see Jesus Christ, who came down to earth as the King. He came humbly, He came in weakness, He came in humanity, yet being the fullness of God, to die for the sins of the world, to die for the hot mess that you and I have caused. And then He rose from the dead, to be crowned, to be acknowledged, to be adored as the King over everything, to unite all that is evil under Him, in His kingdom, under His authority. And when we see leaders fail and our hearts cry out for the perfect leader, we need look no further than Jesus Christ, who is a true King and who's come to save us all. And so a final word to you all. If you are in the middle of something really difficult that you would define or describe as a hot mess, I want you to know that God is working. And what we definitely know is that you and He can be good, that you can have peace with Him, which is the best gift of all. This is how you understand His love. If you think of your trouble as a pile, I don't know how big your mound of trouble is. Well, for God to promise that His love is greater than everything on earth, and you look at your pile of trouble and difficulty, maybe it's sin and guilt or pain, or I don't know what pile you're dealing with, and it looks so big and so insurmountable, but the promise of God, who is a loving King and who wants to give you Himself, is that His love is bigger than your biggest difficulty. That's how big His love is for you. That's your King. That's His authority. And so sometimes it's hard to find God in the mess of life, but you need to look to a King who loves you and who has forgiven you and who holds you. That is Him working in every single situation, no matter what the pain, no matter what the mess.